The first thing to keep in mind while writing your paragraphs is to keep them focused on one main idea. The only thing we really know about any particular paragraph is that it starts with an indented line or some other kind of white space and ends with a line break. Anything that happens in between those 2 points is totally up to you, but those white space boundaries do turn paragraphs into little contained units of language. That means that there should be some kind of integrity to the paragraphs you write, or there should be some reason why everything in a paragraph is there. So you could think of your whole paper as a kitchen, and then you could imagine that each paragraph is like a drawer. There are no rules about what can or can't go in a drawer, so you could just toss all your kitchen tools into whatever drawer you feel like, and no one would arrest you for that. But now imagine that somebody else was going to cook something in your kitchen. They would have a miserable time finding what they needed to get the job done. Where are the measuring spoons? What about the chef's knife? Where do you keep the whisks? Obviously, a stranger would have a much easier time cooking in your kitchen if all the supplies were organized into labeled drawers, one for knives, one for measuring utensils, another for spoons and spatulas, etc. So instead of just throwing anything anywhere, an organized kitchen will have reasons for the things that go in each drawer. And of course, when there are reasons for things to be together in drawers, it becomes a lot easier for someone to navigate the kitchen as they cook. And a very similar thing is at work with a paragraph. Readers are kind of like strangers who are working in your kitchen. They don't know why you have put things in particular paragraphs, so they're going to have a much easier time understanding your point when each paragraph has a clear label of what's inside and when the content of those paragraphs match the label. So paragraphs should be focused on one main idea, and they should tell the reader what they're about pretty early on. And keeping this principle in mind will help you to avoid writing what I call junk drawer paragraphs. Almost every kitchen has a junk drawer, forgotten somewhere in the back corner and full of mismatched odds and ends like loose keys, sticks of gum, screws, and who knows what else. And junk drawer paragraphs are very similar. They talk about multiple things at once in no particular order, and at the end, they may have a sentence that kind of sort of pulls everything together, but not always. Now you, as a writer, might know why you're lumping a bunch of sentences together into one paragraph, but your readers may have trouble grasping that logic without a little bit of help. And that's why a focused topic sentence, or a sentence that tells your readers what the paragraph is about, can be so helpful. First of all, it helps readers to know how they should interpret the information they're about to receive, and secondly, it helps to keep you honest. Anything that doesn't fit the label for that paragraph shouldn't be there. So keep your paragraphs focused. Everything that goes into a drawer should have a reason for being in that drawer, and it should be clear to your readers why the sentences and ideas in a paragraph are there. Our first tip had to do with what your paragraphs are about, or what your paragraphs are. This second one has to do with what your paragraphs are doing in order to support the overall goals of the paper. That is, each paragraph should have a clear purpose. And this can be a tricky difference to get right. For example, a spoon is a stick with a little cup at the end, but a spoon does scooping and stirring. And you could have two papers that are both about the ocean, but they could be doing very different things. For example, one could just be informing people about life at the bottom of the ocean, while the other could be persuading the government to reallocate funds from space exploration to the construction of an undersea research base. Now, these two papers would have very different purposes, and accordingly, each of the paragraphs in those two papers would have to do very different jobs. So let's job. A purposeful paragraph can propose, explain, refute, illustrate, describe, or anything else. It doesn't really matter what your paragraphs are doing, but they need to be doing something, and they should probably only be doing one something. For example, sometimes I'll see students add paragraphs to persuasive essays that don't do much more than share interesting information that they gathered from their research, and this poses a problem when it comes to writing paragraphs with purpose. That's because the only real purpose of a paragraph like that is to share neat stuff, not to support the development of an argument. So that paragraph, because it doesn't serve a purpose for the overall essay, doesn't really belong in that essay. Either that information needs to be given a clear purpose, or perhaps better yet, just delete it outright. Okay, we've got paragraphs that are focused on one idea and that do one job. Now we just need to make sure that our paragraphs don't get too long. So for those of you watching at home, here's a game that you can play along with our studio audience. Our producers will be flashing a set of digits on the screen in 3 rounds. For each round, your task is to memorize the set of digits and repeat them back when asked. Are you ready? Okay, here comes round 1. What were the digits? If you said 9-1, you were correct. And round 2. What were they this time? If you answered 20-20-20, congratulations. And finally, here's round 3. Now, can anyone remember that last string of digits? Hold on, I'm just getting word from the producers that even they can't remember the string of numbers. So the grand prize for tonight's show is being suspended until next week. Okay, so how did you do? My guess is that you did pretty well on the first 2 rounds, but that the third round gave you a little bit of trouble. And that's because human brains can only hold on to so much information at once. People tend to do better when information is broken up into smaller pieces that they can process and then store in slightly longer-term memory baskets. And that's why paragraphs can be so useful. They give readers opportunities to pause, process the information they've just received, and then reset and prepare for the next bit of information. But this is also why long paragraphs can be so counterproductive. The longer the paragraph, the more you risk overtaxing your reader's working memory and losing them in the overwhelming rush of information. But luckily, our first 2 guidelines can go a long way towards helping you to keep your paragraphs brief. Most of the long paragraphs that I see in student writing have obvious points where they shift in either their content or their purpose, and that presents clear places where they could be split into smaller, more manageable paragraphs. Frankly, I think one of the main reasons that I see such overwhelming Frankenstein monster paragraphs is that people have the idea that an essay should only be 5 paragraphs long. So they try smashing 2 or 3 smaller paragraphs into one bigger one in order to maintain that magical number of 5. But guess what? Believe it or not, the 5-paragraph rule is another totally made-up rule. Essays can have however many paragraphs they want. But of course, what counts as brief will vary from situation to situation. The paragraphs that I write in big academic papers tend to be longer than the ones that I write in emails. Sometimes a paragraph will have one complex idea and one purpose, and it will need to take up more space, and that's okay. But you should just be mindful of your readers and their appetites for large chunks of information. The point is that you're generally better with more short paragraphs than with fewer long paragraphs, because it will give your readers more opportunities to take breaks and make sense of what you're saying. Obviously, things that belong in the same drawer should stay in the same drawer. But if you can find ways to subdivide drawers, it's not going to do any harm.